This is a story of lives remembered and lives forgotten. A story of what went right, what went wrong, and the truths that still haunt us today. This is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The name itself is jarring, uncomfortable. By today's standards, it is politically incorrect, but it is the name that lingers. It was never the building's first official name. It was a working title briefly used after the Virginia General Assembly established the Lunatic Asylum west of the Allegheny Mountains. Trans-Allegheny was soon dropped. The former name returned until 1863, when it became the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane. In 1915, it became the Weston State Hospital, and in 1980, Weston Hospital, before closing for good in 1994. The building is the work of Richard Snowden Andrews, a Confederate architect from Baltimore, Maryland. His loyalty to the South was so unyielding that after the war he vowed never to set foot on Union soil again. His legacy is also tied to a little-known arms agreement with Germany. The deal was made, but the war ended before delivery. Some still ask, if those weapons had arrived, could the outcome have changed? But this building is more than a relic of war. It is part of something larger, the Kirkbride Plan. The father of American psychiatry, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, believed light, space, and structure could aid in the recovery for those suffering from mental illness. Following a standardized method of care known as the curative or linear plan, his vision led to over 300 such asylums across North America. Most are gone, but some still remain, like Warren State Hospital in Pennsylvania. But here in Weston, the asylum endures, as both a preserved structure and a reminder of what progress aspired to be and what failure became. Its construction was never easy. West Virginia, newly formed and burdened by statehood, showed little interest in seeing it through. Yet it was completed thanks to the vendors and suppliers who advanced materials, forcing the state to pay. The result is an architectural marvel, the largest hand-cut sandstone building in the United States. The main building is 1,295 feet long, 242,000 square feet, covering roughly 9 acres of floor space, and is often compared to the Kremlin. However, the Kremlin is a complex. This may be, by all accounts, the largest hand-carved stone building in the world. But the asylum's modern image divides those who knew it best. For locals, it feels like a commercialization of suffering, a betrayal of the asylum's truth. These walls hold more than stone and mortar. They carry the weight of the forgotten, the suffering, and the misunderstood. Their voices, some long silent, are waiting to be heard. Let's listen. Ward 1. The word of trust, privilege, and freedom, at least by institutional standards. This ward was home to those who had earned a semblance of normalcy. Patients here were often permitted to leave the grounds. They held jobs in town, walked freely through Weston, and drank at Tootsie's Bar. When they ran up a tab, Tootsie's would call the hospital switchboard, which would pass the message to staff who informed the patient payment was due. As the story goes, the bill was always settled, not because of kindness, but because it had to be. Freedom here was earned, reserved for the hospital's highest functioning patients. The hospital's design reflected this hierarchy. Patients closest to the center and lower floors were the most capable. The further out and higher up you went, the less functional and more dangerous they became. Ward 1 was a threshold between relative liberty and total restriction. Yet even here, disaster struck. In 1935, a teenage patient named Earl Lloyd set a fire that ravaged 8 wards. The hospital had no insurance and the state lacked the funds to rebuild. Assistance came from the Works Progress Administration, a federal relief program. Earl Lloyd's fire became part of Weston's story, one of destruction and survival. At the far end of Ward 1, a large dormitory space served multiple purposes over the years: a dining hall, a surgical suite, and eventually a unit specializing in gastrointestinal procedures. The shift from shared meals to surgery was practical but haunting, a reminder that this was not merely a place of confinement, but a home where life and death coexisted. Ward 4, the ward of age and decline. From the 1970s until its closure in 1994, this ward held elderly patients, fragile souls who leaned on handrails that, after the hospital was closed, were stolen, leaving only scars on the walls. This ward also housed the Mountaineer Care Unit and Drug and Alcohol Rehabilitation Unit, two vastly different populations forced to coexist. But many were placed here by necessity, displaced from the geriatrics building where multiple patients died from heat-related illnesses. A lack of air conditioning worsened by budget cuts turned the building into an oven. When summer heat soared, patients perished. The partition lattice at the hall's end was once a nurse's station, a symbol of vigilance that, in the end, could not prevent death. What is the lesson? Comfort is not a luxury, it is survival. Neglect is not passive, it is lethal. And those who die from oversight are not forgotten, they teach us. The foundation, both literally and historically, of the asylum. This was the first section to be completed, built by prison labor and stonemasons under the supervision of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It opened on October 22, 1864. The hospital was unfinished, the war still raged, but patients arrived nonetheless. Those patients came from Longview Asylum in Cincinnati and other institutions in Ohio and Virginia. But the story is not so simple. Virginia had cared for patients from the western counties of what would become West Virginia. When West Virginia seceded, those patients were abruptly denied services. Virginia demanded payment for their continued care, cutting them off from support. Ohio stepped forward, offering care free of charge. It was an act of compassion. West Virginia later paid Ohio, a gesture of gratitude, a rare moment when empathy outweighed bureaucracy. Within this section, rare amenities existed: a gymnasium and an outdoor covered 10-pin bowling alley. In a world of isolation and suffering, these small luxuries offered brief glimpses of normalcy. But this section also bore the weight of tragedy. Here, faucets and shower controls are still found behind lockable panels, a safety measure introduced after the death of patient William Cook on August 23, 1891. He died from burns suffered in a bathtub elsewhere, but his death sparked a change. No longer would patients have unsupervised access to water temperatures, at least, not for a time. Over the years, those safeguards decayed. Locks rusted, doors broke away. A familiar pattern, here, every measure of progress seemed destined to erode. Later, a physical therapy office occupied this section. In the 1960s, the therapist's granddaughter visited him during sessions, her laughter mixed with the sounds of patients relearning how to move. A reminder that even here, life persisted, not merely survival, but moments of joy. This room began as the hospital's kitchen, feeding hundreds, later thousands, but as time wore on, it became something far different. By the 1950s, medication replaced restraint as the tool of control. The introduction of Thorazine in 1954 heralded a new era in psychiatric care, the first antipsychotic medication. For some patients, Thorazine was liberation, a means of reclaiming stability, a bridge back to their families. For others, it was a sedation masquerading as treatment. It dulled the mind, dulled the body, and dulled the spirit. Tardive dyskinesia, uncontrollable facial movements, shifting gaits, and lifeless gazes became all too common. Haldol, Melloral, and lithium followed. Each promised relief, and each delivered it, but with a price. Lithium stabilized moods, but toxicity loomed with every dose. An imbalance could damage the kidneys or stop the heart. Medication was freedom. Medication was imprisonment. Both were true. The balance between care and control blurred, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. Doctors sought to help, but they sought order too, and sometimes order came first. This was the nerve center of the institution. The superintendent's office, where life and death decisions were made with the stroke of a pen. The assistant physician's office, where diagnoses were rendered and futures were sealed. The steward's office, where numbers mattered more than names. The apothecary, where hope was compounded alongside sedation. The staff dining room, where laughter was shared just steps away from human despair. These rooms housed authority, but they also housed tragedy. Dr. Albert Kunst lived here. He was a symbol of administration itself, both of what went right and what went wrong. He was an advocate for better care, yet he existed within a system that often protected itself over its patients. He lost two sons to suicide. One, Karl Kunst, died by gunshot in 1904. Reports conflict. Some say it was here, others at their home. What is certain is this: the weight of Weston spared no one, not even those in charge. In 1915, a long-awaited dining hall was constructed behind this section. Governor Henry Hatfield intervened to push the project forward after multiple funding delays. During construction, workers unearthed a hidden tunnel believed to have been a forgotten service passage leading to the boiler house. The tunnel collapsed long ago, but its rediscovery in 2014 reminded all that the ground beneath Weston is layered with secrets. And then there were the quieter deaths. On May 7, 1960, William McCurdle choked to death on a shredded wheat biscuit during breakfast. Supervision failed. Violence was not the only killer here. Neglect was its partner. Above the administrators, 16 nurses lived in small apartments. Among them was Mary Ryan. She could have worked anywhere, but she chose here. Mary worked as a nurse, an attendant, and in the laundry. She lived between the hospital and her family home on Cottage Avenue until her sister was admitted as a patient. Mary stayed. Mary stayed because people mattered to her. She died here on January 14, 1944, age 92. Mary is what went right. When this hospital was at its best, it was not because of policy, it was because of people like Mary. The most dangerous women were held here, or at least those deemed dangerous. Staff walking back to back, pressing against the walls. These are tales, perhaps exaggerated, but the fear was real. On May 25, 1963, Muriel Kramer was strangled to death by Wanda Maxine Janes. Janes had been admitted only a week earlier, a nurse, a veteran, now a killer. The state said they could have not known she was violent, but both were placed on Ward C, a ward built for violence. Muriel was an African American. To be mentally ill was to be invisible. To be of color and mentally ill was to be erased. The lesson? Protection was a privilege Muriel was denied. The most violent male patients lived here. Reinforced seclusion rooms, double doors, metal window guards, and restraint rings. Tools of control, but also symbols of neglect. Dean Matheny died here on September 17, 1989, beaten to death by 2 other patients. A preventable demise. The myth that only the placing staff could release patients is false, but the truth was worse. No one was watching. What is the lesson? That when you lock a man away, you hold his life in your hands, and when you forget him, you kill him. Completed in 1880, this floor was originally intended as attic space, but its purpose, like so much in this hospital, shifted with time. In the early years, staff members called this place home. 12-hour shifts were the norm, and those who chose to live here paid $12 per month in rent, their sex and position sometimes influencing their accommodations. Cramped rooms, low ceilings, heat rising to suffocating levels in the summer, and cold that crept through the walls in the winter. For many staff, the hospital was not just a place where they worked, it is where they lived. Weston was not just a job, it was their world. Later, patients deemed high-functioning found themselves here, those closest to normal by institutional standards, yet still not free. Their reward for stability was an attic room beneath a slate roof, above lives unraveling below. The flooring itself tells the story of transition, moving abruptly from cold concrete to worn wooden planks. Progress meeting practicality. The small dormers and skylights punctuating the roofline were added after the devastating 1935 fire, a nod to the original Kirkbride vision of sunlight and fresh air as medicine. A brief return to hope before the weight of overcrowding and neglect pressed it down once more. As time went on, the wards evolved again. This space became home to the hospital drug and alcohol rehabilitation unit before, full circle, it became staff housing again in the facility's final years. A reminder that here, change was constant, but progress was not. The basement is not where these procedures occurred, but it is where the visuals will lead us. It is dark, cold, and endless, the stone walls absorbing more than moisture, they absorb memory. Treatments for the mentally ill over the years have varied, involving Utica cribs, hydrotherapy, insulin shock therapy, electroshock therapy, and many others. This is where the imagery will accompany the narration of one of the most harrowing chapters in mental health history, the era of the transorbital lobotomy. Dr. Walter Freeman arrived in his Thunderbird, his instruments packed in a simple case. He was a man driven by progress, but also blinded by it. The ice pick lobotomy, a procedure designed to sever the prefrontal cortex, was championed as a miracle. It was fast, it was cheap, and it required no operating room. But it took more than illness, it took identity. Patients were left catatonic, reduced to shells of their former selves. Alive but not living. One woman described her sister after a lobotomy as having eyes that were open but vacant, like the soul had been carved out. For some, it was an end to violence. For most, it was the end of being human. The basement will bear witness to this narration, not as the scene of the crime, but as a symbol of what happens when treatment becomes convenience. It is the image of forgotten people. This brick structure, built from 1929 to 1930, stood next to the site of the former men's building. It was built to modernize care, to centralize medicine and treatment, not just for the facility, but for the community as well. Allegedly, the medical center was given an A rating by the state and American hospital associations when the clinic opened in 1933. Here, patients were x-rayed, surgeries performed, and autopsies conducted. The purchasing clerk worked from within these walls, and in its final years, this building served as the Lewis County 911 Center, a strange final chapter for a structure built to heal. The morgue, cold and silent, held those who died awaiting family to claim them. But what if no one came? Records suggest the idea of a holding structure was discussed, perhaps even built, on the grounds near the cemeteries, but its existence is uncertain. The mere discussion, however, reveals a truth, that even in death, convenience sometimes outweighed compassion. And for those whose families had abandoned them, or those whose families had perished long before, there was only one resting place: the cemeteries. 3 burial grounds established in 1864, the early 1870s, and at an undetermined date, hold over 2,340 men, women, and children. Fewer than 30 headstones remain, those who had families with means. The rest were marked with only numbered bricks. Those bricks were removed in 1979. Contract workers, unsupervised, piled them near the entrance, and locals took them as souvenirs. Some were returned, but most were lost. The West Virginia State Hospital Initiative, Incorporated, through Project Dignity, fights to reclaim that what was taken, not merely bricks, but names. But the state resists, and some, with their own histories tied to this place, guard it as their story alone. History does not belong to one voice, it belongs to us all. Built in 1940, this structure was first named the Psychiatric Unit, but would later become simply known as the Tuberculosis Building. Its opening was delayed, another victim of the hospital's greatest enemy, funding shortages. For years, it sat largely vacant. When patients finally arrived, it became a place of isolation. Those suffering from tuberculosis or consumption were sent here. There was no cure. Fresh air, rest, patience, that was all they had. Streptomycin, the first antibiotic successful in treating consumption, would not come until 1944, with isoniazid following in 1952. By then, for many, it was too late. Only one floor opened at first, one attendant working each side, one for men and one for women, working in 12-hour shifts. Monotony ruled. Patients sat in near silence day after day, surrounded by scarce, worn furnishings. Treatment ranged from gentle to brutal: hydrotherapy baths, ultraviolet light therapy, needle showers, and the Scotch douche, a violent burst of hot and cold water meant to shock the system. Desperation disguised as innovation. Even into the 1960s, tuberculosis remained a fear here. The hospital employed chemical germicides to disinfect surfaces, methods later questioned for their own toxicity. As the disease waned, this building changed. Its residents, outcast still, did not. This space was repurposed as Ward 14, housing individuals with developmental disabilities. The term used then, mental retardation unit, is now recognized as both outdated and offensive. The walls were different, the suffering was not. Isolation, neglect, and the absence of dignity. Completed in 1954, this dormitory-style structure was the last major addition to the hospital grounds. It was built for Weston's aging population, patients who had grown old within these walls, many having spent their entire adult lives here. Its design mirrored the forensics unit, practical, sterile, prioritizing control over comfort. But those who lived here pushed back against the coldness. Murals appeared, cartoon characters, bright flowers, whimsical scenes painted onto institutional walls, small bursts of color, small declarations of humanity. As if to say, we are still here, we still matter. But the building harbored a fatal flaw: ventilation. In the 1970s, several patients died here from heat-related illnesses. The upper floors became ovens in the summertime heat. Air conditioning units were installed, but budget cuts led to them being switched off to save money. Each heat wave brought dread. Each summer carried risk. Until finally the building was abandoned as a care facility and geriatric patients were transferred to Ward 4. Neglect killed them. That is the lesson. But this building story does not end with care, it ended with confinement. In the mid-1980s, West Virginia sought to convert the hospital into a prison. The geriatrics building was the first to be stripped of its identity, steel bars installed, windows reinforced, and cells constructed. It was meant to house elderly and infirm inmates as part of a broader plan to replace Moundsville Penitentiary. Patients died here, forgotten in the heat. Now, prisoners would die here, forgotten behind bars. A machine shop was added intended to teach inmates vocational skills. The murals remained, watching over the clang of steel and the hum of industrial tools. But the plan collapsed. In 1987, the courts ruled the conversion unconstitutional. What some called practicality was exposed as injustice. And the governor who championed the idea, Arch Moore, would later serve time in federal prison for corruption. A man who tried to turn a place built for healing into a cage, finding himself in one. Historian Titus Swan reflected on this bitter irony by saying, "At first glance, this could have worked, but ultimately, it is better it was ruled unconstitutional. This would have been an immense failure, compounding what was already, in many ways, a system built on failure." Today, the geriatric building stands mostly empty. The signs remain and the murals fade. But the lesson endures. When institutions fail to see the humanity in those they house, whether patient or prisoner, the result is the same. A place built for care becomes a place of punishment, and the people inside become ghosts long before they die. Built in 1949 by Edward Wood & Sons, this 25,000 square foot structure cost $353,000. It was intended to be escape-proof. Bulletproof windows, reinforced walls, and a red light above the entrance, signaling lockdown. It housed those deemed criminally insane. Some awaiting trial, others found incompetent to stand before a judge. But to those inside it was called other things. Where the devil lived. Hell on earth. A nightmare you cannot imagine. Security was strict, but escapes happened, proof that even concrete walls can crack. Worse than the escapes were the abuses. Patients were restrained not for safety, but for ease. Haldol injections were not just medicine, they were weapons. One survivor said, "You didn't talk back. I did once. They shot me up with Haldol and said if I questioned them again, they'd give me so much I'd never walk again." Another recounted, "I watched a black man turn blue. The staff did nothing. They just watched." Those who survived bear scars on their bodies and their minds. They shared their stories, but not their names. Even today, they fear. Fear that speaking out will bring retribution. What does that say? That this place is gone, but the terror lives on. The Women's Auxiliary Building was built in 1887 to help ease the already overcrowded facility. The layout is similar to the Geriatrics and Forensics Building with its long corridors and central administration section. Within the walls of this building, a phrase, warehousing of the mentally ill, later came to light when the facility housed over 2,600 patients at one time. During the 1970s, as the patient population began to wane, this building was closed. For much of its history, Weston State Hospital was self-sufficient. Patients and staff worked side by side on the farm. They raised livestock, grew crops, and operated a dairy. Produce and meat were sold, funding the hospital and feeding those inside. The work was therapeutic for some, forced for others. The line between labor and therapy often blurred. The current greenhouse, built in the 1940s, is the fourth on site. Its predecessors were destroyed by storms and fires. The land gave life, but it demanded toil. By the 1990s, the asylum was collapsing under its own weight. Deinstitutionalization swept across the country. West Virginia's version, the Hartley Plan, promised dignity through community care. The reality was abandonment. Funding never fully came. In the final years, patients slept in hallways, 7 crammed into a single corridor because there was nowhere else to put them. When the hospital closed in 1994, many staff were laid off, cast aside much like the patients they had cared for. Some found work at Sharp Hospital, the state facility that replaced Weston, while others saw their careers end with those locked doors. Patients who could not be placed elsewhere faced a similar fate. Reports say the state purchased homes for some, but in time, those homes and the people inside were forgotten. Just as the state has forgotten so much of what happened here. For some patients, the displacement was a death sentence. Those who had spent their entire lives under supervised care were thrust into group homes, nursing facilities, or onto the street. They entered a system that did not know them, did not understand their needs, and sometimes did not care. Former staff and locals tell of what happened. Some patients died within weeks, others within months. Some froze to death, some were over-medicated, while others simply wasted away. One patient, once stable within Weston, was found wandering the streets, filthy and starving. Another woman was placed in a group home, forgotten there, left sedated in a room until her body gave out. What was promised as community care became community neglect. These are not rumors. These are the accounts of those who were there, those who watched it happen. Weston lost its largest employer, families fractured, some patients went on to nursing home, others to the streets, and some died, forgotten. But those who bore witness, the staff, patients, they still carry it. The weight of knowing that those who needed help the most were not just displaced, they were discarded. The building was empty, but suffering continued, just out of sight. Mary mattered. Dean mattered. Muriel mattered. The man who turned blue, he mattered. Their names, their lives, they mattered. Because when we forget their names, we forget they were ever here. And if we let that happen, what will happen to the rest of us? We remember because you are listening, and by listening, you help prove that every life has a worth.